Thank you very much, Joe, for that introduction. It's a great honour and privilege to be invited to speak to you again. I've been involved with I4 now for several years, and I've talked in Hawaii and in Japan, and it's a great privilege, and here previously as well, so it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to you all, and I'm very thankful for that. As Joe said, I began my career as a photojournalist covering news and current affairs. The biggest story I was involved in was the break of the former Yugoslavia, and I photographed the siege of Sarajevo in particular for more or less the whole duration of that conflict. But in 2005, I guess I'd be sort of poacher-turned gamekeeper. I turned to the academy, and for the last 10 years or so, I've been focused more on writing and thinking about photography. I read history at my first degree, and I've kind of returned to that, I suppose, as an academic now. So what I'm going to do is take you on a kind of slightly whistle-stop tour through 150-odd years of photography with a focus on the photography of conflict, because I think that's a very interesting lens, forgive the metaphor there, through which to view both photography, but particularly photography's role as a witness into historical affairs. There are other lenses I could have used, but obviously conflict is one of the defining features of the modern world, if not the entire history of humanity. And I think the way that photography has responded to, documented, witnessed, and engaged with the nature of conflict is a very, very important theme and very telling one. But I think it's very important, starting with photography, it's important to remember that it's a technological prosthetic. The camera is a sort of a way of transporting you through time and place to a location that you couldn't have been at physically. It allows you to witness, as it were, as a proxy, through the lens of the camera and through the eye of the photographer, a situation that you couldn't possibly be there at firsthand. And it gives you this extraordinary sense of kind of being there, and we still feel that, I think. This is one of the very earliest photographs, arguably the earliest photograph ever taken by Joseph Nichols in 1826. And you have to remember as well that the early photographers were as much chemists and scientists as they were artists, because they were experimenting with how could you actually capture light through some sort of lens and fix that onto a sheet of paper or a negative to actually create the photographic image that now is so ubiquitous. And of course, one of the interesting things about that now, of course, we look at photographs, we look at this on the screen, it looks like a photograph, but actually it's just pixels projected from a source. So there is actually no material photograph here we're looking at, and yet it has the appearance of materiality. It feels like a tangible physical object that you can look at. And I think the materiality of the photograph is a very interesting philosophical question to think about in terms of its sort of nature, as it were. This is a picture from 1846 by Frederick Martins of the street of a Panorama of Paris. Again, Martins was an engineer. He built one of the very first rotating panoramic cameras in order to make this extraordinary image, which was a giant print when it was exhibited. It was a camera that had a kind of clockwork mechanism that allowed it to rotate to be able to make this panorama. And of course, it was taken in 1846, just before the 1848 revolutions, which were captured by a photographer only known as Tito, who had the extraordinary resourcefulness and bravery to climb up onto the rooftops to photograph the barricades the day before they were attacked by the French military, and then the day after. And it was one of the very first sort of before and after what is now known as a genre of aftermath photography. And the passage of time is very clear in these photographs, and the photographer's realization that he could capture the before and after of the attack that broke the 1848 revolution. It was also one of the very first photographs ever published in the press in a newspaper called L'Illustration Journal Universal, 4 or 5 days after the actual action happened. And of course, after this, the streets of Paris were cleared to create the wide boulevards that were intended for the fast, rapid movement of troops. The picture we just saw, the Panorama of Paris, is a Paris which now has disappeared and is, of course, now only visible in a photograph or a plan or a street map, because you can't actually stand in that spot anymore because those streets have been destroyed. And destruction is obviously one of the great themes of photography, of particularly photography of conflict. This is by James Robertson. It's the interior of the Great Redoubt at Sevastopol during the Crimean War, and a scene of utter carnage and devastation and destruction. Likewise, Roger Fenton, who many of you may be familiar with, the British photographer, who was essentially one of the first propaganda photographers. He was assigned by the Queen and by the British government to go out to the Crimea to make pictures to sort of further the cause, really, and promote Britain's interests and Britain's kind of great war effort. In fact, he consciously self-censored himself. He wrote in his diaries that he saw dead bodies, he saw bones sticking out of the ground, but he didn't photograph them because it was against the sort of British interests to show such a thing. So there are no photographs of dead bodies in his work, but what there is this extraordinary photograph that's entitled The Valley of Death. It's not the Valley of Death from the famous poem. It's another Valley of Death, because there are a lot of them in the Crimea. But you can see here that, the sense, the visual composition, the structure of the photograph, and of course this incredible sea of cannonballs has this amazingly powerful effect, I think, on your imagination. You feel like you're a soldier marching up this hill into a hail of fire that will be ripping apart your friends and your colleagues. Imagine what kind of bravery it took, or folly perhaps, to kind of advance under this kind of heavy fire. Fenton put himself under fire as well. He went up to the front lines during the shelling. Shells were landing around him. And of course, you've got to remember that at the time, Fenton was working with a very large wooden camera on a tripod. The glass plate negatives were 20 inches by 24 inches. So, this kind of size. Huge sheets of glass that you had to, in the field, you had to coat it with the chemical just before the exposure, make the exposure, which would last several minutes often, and then immediately take it back to process it. That's why he had this mobile laboratory, his field camper van, as it were. So he would be processing his film on the front line itself. And then, of course, having to send the negatives, the glass plate negatives, back. And often they were drawn by an artist who would convert it into a line drawing to be used in the press at the time. So again, just remembering, I think one of the things when you're looking at photographs, it's very important to sort of project yourself backwards in time technologically. So we look at old photographs now, we look at 19th century photographs, they look old. But you've got to remember that at the time, that was the white heat of communication. This was the moment, this was the cutting edge of technology. It was the digital camera of its age, because in terms of the time lag between the photograph being taken and arriving in the mainstream press, that period was incredibly fast. Now it's seconds, then it was weeks and days and weeks, but in equivalent terms, that was instant communication from the front lines. This is Felix Beato's photograph of the ruins of the Sikandar Bagh Palace in Lucknow, taken about 2 months after it fell to the British forces after the Indian Mutiny in 1858. And extraordinary image because of its beauty in a strange way. It's the incredible beauty of the building, the way it's been destroyed, and then also the very strange and haunting, the bodies lying in front of the building in this very peculiar sort of open-air burial. And there's a little bit of controversy about whether those bodies were moved or not, but still a very, very powerful photograph. And when you look at these 19th century pictures, especially if anybody's ever looked at one, who's actually looked at a real 19th century print from a 19th century camera? Put your hand up if you have. Okay, more of you need to go into archives and look at them, because they're incredibly beautiful objects. And because the glass plate negatives were so large, the level of detail, because they're printed as a contact sheet. So you basically take the sheet of glass, put it on top of the photographic paper, and make a direct print from the glass sheet. The level of detail in these early photographs is phenomenal. You can literally go in with a microscope, and there's almost no grain. They're very, very beautiful objects. This is the shirt from Archduke Maximilian I, who was appointed Emperor of Mexico by Napoleon III in 1864, but obviously was a very short-lived empireship, as it were, because he was executed in the Cerro de la Campas in Mexico on June 19th, 1867, by the Nationalist followers of Benito Juarez. Now, obviously, there's no photographs of the actual execution, but what we do have is this extraordinarily powerful photograph of the aftermath of that execution. This is the shirt that he wore, riddled with bullet holes. And I think that photography has this extraordinary ability to work with material objects to create these very, very powerful statements about the past. So this is a photograph of a shirt, but it has this incredible presence of the human that lived in that shirt, and then of the fate of that human as well. This is Quartermaster Fabry of the 1st Hussars, taken in about 1852 on the commemoration of the birthday of Emperor Napoleon. This is one of the soldiers that fought at the Battle of Waterloo, and every year the surviving veterans would meet, dress up in their uniforms. Admittedly, their uniforms have been let out a little bit to give them a bit more space, but they would meet every year and parade together to commemorate the great leader, Emperor Napoleon. It's a beautiful set of portraits in one of the collections in the Anne Wilkes Museum of Military History in Brown University. And very, very haunting portrait. It tells us a lot, I think, about the kind of character of these men, what they went through, and also their sort of pride. 40 years after the Battle of Waterloo, they're still very proudly demonstrating themselves to the camera. The American Civil War was obviously, arguably one of the first global large-scale international events that was really documented extensively by the camera. Because obviously it lasted for a long period of time. There were literally thousands of photographers that were involved. We know of the famous ones, Timothy O'Sullivan, Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, for example, but there were thousands and thousands of others that worked with the units photographing. So it's probably the first fully documented conflict in the history of the world, really. And it produced some extraordinary images. And I think it produced images of war and of death that are almost unparalleled even today. You know, we don't see dead Americans anymore. The US government, the Pentagon heavily censors our ability to see the dead from Afghanistan and Iraq. These images, when they were published, when they were held in exhibitions on the streets, caused a huge impact in terms of people's understanding of what the realities of modern warfare was about. And there's some very interesting and telling historical things you can pull from these as well. You know, this is a group of Negro workers recovering the bodies of the dead. And a very, very powerful statement, I think, about the kind of internal workings of the system there. And, you know, again, this was the first war where en masse people died, not in their homes with their families, but they died in a faraway field, and their bodies then had to be recovered. And the kind of necropolitics of who owns those bodies, how they were returned, the cemeteries and so on, was kind of really established in the American Civil War. And some extraordinarily beautiful pictures, again, come out of this, I think. This is Alexander Gardner's photograph of the ruins of the Gallego Mills in Richmond, taken in 1865, shortly after it had fallen, marking the end of the Civil War, really. And, you know, Richmond was obviously this sort of powerhouse, economic powerhouse of the South. It was the kind of focal point. And the Gallego Mills was one of the biggest flour mills in the world at the time, and it was reduced to rubble. So as a symbolic representation of the destruction of the American economy that was wrought by the American Civil War, it's a very, very powerful one. Again, an extraordinarily beautiful object shot with two glass plates sort of stitched together to make a panorama. You know, the tangible materiality of this image is very, very powerful when you see it in an original print. This is by a relatively unknown photographer called John Burke, who was an Irish photographer working out in Afghanistan during the Second Afghan War. And, you know, like many photographers, of course, there's very much like Alexander Gardner, the American Civil War, there's a kind of a tension between their role as a documentarian, but also as a commercial agent. So both Gardner and James Burke were essentially trying to sell their pictures. They were trying to sell their pictures to the army officers they were photographing. They were trying to sell them back for consumption back at home, at the same time trying to make powerful documents and aesthetic documents of what they were seeing. I find this picture extraordinary because of where the British soldier is in this. These are Allied soldiers working with the British, and if you look at it, it's very non-hierarchical. Most colonial photography situates the white imperial sort of, you know, god, as it were, in the center stage, sort of commanding the local natives, to use that rather unpleasant phrasing. In this one, if you can see him, but the British officer is in mufti. He's way back. Where are we? That's the, oops, sorry. Go back. If we can spot him. That is the British officer hiding in the back there, dressed up like the natives. And as I said earlier on, you know, what would happen is the negative would be hand-drawn by an illustrator in the field, and that would then be shipped back to the newspapers, in this case the Illustrated London News, to be published typically about 6 weeks after it was taken, which in the late 19th century is an incredibly rapid turnaround time for these kind of things. Again, so photography as evidence is a very, very important part of this process as well, evidence of war crimes, effectively. And arguably, you know, the massacre at Wounded Knee in the 1890s was one of the last war crimes against the Native American people. And this was a photograph taken by, ironically, a photographer who specialized in what was called a TP photographer. He was specialized in portraits and postcards of Native American life. But because he had connections with the Native American tribes, he was one of the first photographers there after the massacre and made this very powerful. And I think the handwritten text on there is a very, very powerful kind of, the sort of inscribing the location literally into the fabric of the photograph itself is a very, very powerful testament. It says, "Burial of the Dead at the Battle of Wounded Knee, Northwestern Photo Co., Shadran Neb." And of course, photography as the portrait genre is a very powerful way of communicating as well. And I think, you know, you look at this photograph of Wild Bill Hitchcock, Buffalo Bill and Sitting Bull. You know, Sitting Bull has a pretty ironic look on his face, and, you know, Buffalo Bill is staring off into the distance there. This was a promotional, sort of almost like a circus act by this point, but I think it says a lot about the history of the American wars and the way that was then represented in American culture afterwards. One of the interesting things about historical photographs, of course, is they get repurposed and they get misaligned and they get miscaptioned. This is often shown to be the arrest of Gavrilo Princip after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28th, 1914, which kind of launched the First World War. It's a very dramatic photograph. It looks like it should be the arrest of Princip, but it's not. It's actually the arrest of a passerby who was called Ferdinand Bear, but because at the time it was this very dramatic photograph, and we can tell it's not Princip because the Bear is clean-shaven and Princip had a moustache at the time, so we're pretty sure it's not. But it was a very dramatic photograph. It looks like it should be, and therefore it is. So it became widely circulated as a photograph of the arrest of the actual perpetrator, when in fact it wasn't. Again, coming back to the portrait, I think portraits as a format, they do invite the viewer to associate, to empathize in some way with the subject. The invitation of the portrait is that you are supposed to learn something and make some connection, some kind of positive connection with the person in the image. These are three young farmers photographed by August Sander, the great German portrait photographer who embarked on this massive project between the two world wars, trying to document the entire sort of German nation. This was actually taken during World War I, and it's actually three young men who fought in the war. They went on to fight in the war. Ewald and Oscar Augustus Klein, two young brothers, and Otto Krieger. And Klein was killed on the Western Front and also was wounded twice. So, this has this sort of a symbolic of that whole generation of men that went over the top and lost their lives and were wounded and their lives were scarred forever in the battles of World War I. And so when we look at a photograph like this, the sense of a history projecting forwards from the moment the photograph was taken is very, very powerful. I'd argue that photographs are temporal objects, not just in terms of when they were taken, but also that they project forwards and backwards. They represent the present, they represent the past into the present. And we can't help but imagine when we look at this photograph of these young men, what happened to them and their generation in the battles of the First World War that came so soon afterwards. And this is a photograph by the Australian military photographer called Frank Hurley. And it's a very interesting picture because Frank Hurley witnessed at first hand the battles of the First World War, the explosions, the shelling, the air combat, but he was frustrated by his inability to record that with the technology of the day. He couldn't in one frame capture the dynamics and the incredible ferocity of the fighting. So he made these extraordinary composite photographs where he stitched together multiple negatives, made enormous prints that were the size of this wall when they were exhibited. Came into a lot of controversy for that. In fact, the Australian military officers decided that this was unethical and was faking it. So it's a very interesting question about, Frank Hurley felt he was being true to his experience of what he'd seen by making these composite pictures, because he wasn't able to properly represent that with the technology, and yet he was critiqued for, inverted commas, faking it. So they're, again, very powerful objects. And objects, I think, are very, very interesting things. Photographs of things, I argue, have a kind of a double material presence. There is the thing itself, which has a kind of presence, if you like, and then there's the photograph itself, which becomes a thing. So it's this kind of multiple levels of thingness, as it were, if you like. These are extraordinary objects, photographed by Horace Nichols, who was the Imperial War Museum's first official photographer in 1916. It was photographed at what was colloquially known as the Tin Noses shop, which was part of the Masks for Facial Disfigurement department, which was founded by a professor of fine art at the Royal Academy who was too old to serve in the front lines, but decided to turn his skills as a painter and as a sculptor to creating these incredibly beautiful, strangely haunting prosthetics for the faces of wounded soldiers. World War I had one of the highest levels of facial disfigurement of any conflict because the soldiers were they were naive enough to put their heads up above the parapet and were shot and shelled and so on. And this was an incredible department that kind of made these very haunting and strange apparatus, as it were, again, prosthetics to reclaim the faces of the wounded. This is, often photography sort of situates you, I think, as part of the action or as an eyewitness. And this perspective, this aerial perspective, I think absolutely positions the viewer as a witness of this historic event. This is the July days, 5th of July 1917 in Petrograd, the riot after the provisional government opened fire on the Bolshevik demonstrations. And you sense the urgency, you sense the drama, you sense the terror as well, and you sense this kind of build-up of what was then going to go on to be the October revolutions on the streets. Also, some pretty amazing things are done by photographers. This, as it was a propaganda picture taken by a guy called Arthur Mole with his partner John Thomas, who made about 20 of these, which involved literally tens of thousands of soldiers for each photograph. He had an 80-foot high platform that he built, where he would go to US military bases and he would arrange them in these extraordinary sort of visual paintings almost, of representing the American eagle, the face of the then president, and in this case, a giant machine gun with an American eagle. So every one of those is a little figure. These are all soldiers, and of course, arranged so that in the front line there's one guy, because of the perspective, and the line at the back, there's thousands of men in order to create the necessary perspective. And he would mark it all out very carefully with rope on the ground, and these things would take days to produce. Extraordinary set of images. And of course, photographs can absolutely encapsulate a moment. This is Armistice Day, the end of the First World War. This is what was one of the London buses with civilians and soldiers, cheering. And again, it's a fantastically powerful evocation of that moment in time. And the photographer here has captured a visual, very strong aesthetic, very dramatic aesthetic, and a great kind of moment of celebration. And capturing those kind of very powerful moments, I'm up on the podium here now. One of the classic things you do as a press photographer is photograph speeches by politicians, and this is Robert Capa's photograph of Leon Trotsky in 1936 giving a very impassioned speech that was very widely reproduced at the time. It was one of the very first kind of moments of this sort of thing that had been seen in the popular press. And actually, the photograph's a little bit degraded because of the way it was produced, but actually that adds, I think, to the drama in some way. It makes it more visceral, makes it more real, more immediate almost, because it is flawed in a sense. And that photograph was taken by arguably one of the most famous war photographers of all time, Robert Capa, who, as many of you will know, was a young Hungarian exile who reinvented himself. His real name was not Robert Capa. He invented that as a sort of nom de plume because he felt that an American would have more chance of getting published in the newspapers and magazines than an obscure Hungarian. So he kind of invented himself a sort of his own fake persona. He took many very famous pictures of war, which were published in the very early photo magazines. And again, think about the technology. The 35mm camera had just been invented, the Leica and the Contax. It was small, it used roll film, it was very mobile, and that allowed photographers to capture things that they'd never been able to capture before. Frontline action, literally the moments of attack, the moments of death. And those pictures were very, very rapidly transmitted back to the agencies and then sold onto the magazines and published all around the world. And so, in a pre-television age, the illustrated magazine, things like Picture Post, Life magazine, Vu, Berliner Illustrated Zeitung that emerged across Europe and America, and indeed there were copies of them in Soviet Russia and in China as well, became this kind of defining way in which the world got its news, the way in which the world was literally transported to the front lines of history to see what was happening. But Capa is often sort of seen, his famous maxim was, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough, which is a very powerful thing to say, but I think it went beyond that. I think he didn't just mean physical proximity, I think he meant psychological and emotional proximity to the situation as well. This is a photograph he took during the very first German air raids in the Spanish Civil War. And I think it's a very, very powerful image of the destruction of a whole way of life, that bourgeois, middle-class life, the painting the photograph of the relatives on the wall, the flock wallpaper, the beautiful bureau, all destroyed by this unique phenomenon of aerial bombing. Because when planes drop bombs, they go through the top of buildings. Shells tend to go through the sides of buildings, but planes go through the top, creating this extraordinary light that comes down from above as opposed to from the side. And Capa very powerfully captured this very poignant image, I think, of the destruction of a whole way of life by war. And likewise, it doesn't always have to show the actual moment of death, the moment of attack, the moment of violence. The photographs are very, very good at evoking a sense of what might be about to happen. This is on the streets of Bilbao. These are civilians rushing for cover because they're afraid of an air raid. And you sense the absolute tension in these people as this mother, as she clutches her child's hand, hoping to get her to safety. And another type of mother saluting their children. This is, very powerful representation, obviously, of the political forces that were that were mirror image of what was happening in the Spanish Civil War, the rise of fascism, the rise of Hitler. And I think we're often very surprised when we see color photographs from this period. There's a sort of shock there because we're so inured and so accustomed to seeing black and white until sort of end of the Second World War, really, so the kind of rise of Kodachrome in the 1950s. So when we do see a color picture from this period, it makes us jump almost. And it's a very interesting thing now that we're so, black and white is a complete abstraction. Why is it that we're so used to black and white as a historical moment, and then when we see a color picture from the same period, it somehow makes it, the color looks fake in a strange way. We respond to it in the opposite way to the way you would. It's quite counterintuitive. And of course, photography provides evidence of the links between certain politicians and certain other governments, which was such a controversial topic today. This obviously is the Duke and Duchess of Windsor after the abdication in 1937, meeting with Hitler at a point when there were all sorts of rumours and suspicions about collusion between elements of the British government and the British aristocracy and the Nazi Party. One of the great things about working in the archives is these wonderful moments when you discover things you'd never seen before. I was doing some research on World War II, and I came across this wonderful photograph of Tito, and obviously I've spent a lot of time in the former Yugoslavia, so he's kind of an interesting character for me. Tito with his famous dog, and in one of the caves in which he was hiding from the Germans, and to me it just absolutely sums up the kind of partisan warfare. You know, he's in this cave, wearing quite a smart uniform, because he is the president, he is the leader of the Yugoslav at that point army, with his favorite dog, but of course his phone is on a rather sort of makeshift wooden chair there. That's the best he can do in terms of his office furniture. So I think it's a very powerful image that really sums up, I think, the nature of partisan warfare and the nature of Tito as a commander. This is Robert Capa's famous photograph from the D-Day landings, which, as many of you will know, was the inspiration for the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan, the movie. Again, it's a photograph, I think, which there's actually very little in it. It's blurred, it's out of focus. It's very, very literally black and white, very high contrast. There's not a lot of detail in there. And yet, as an evocation of what it would have been like, what it might have felt like to be in the water, with that first wave of soldiers landing on the beach, it's an incredibly powerful testament, I think, and literally eyewitness testimony. I mean, Capa admitted himself that he was, basically absolutely himself on the beaches there. He was terrified. He admitted in the end that actually the camera was shaking. He called his biography slightly out of focus. And I think that's partly because of the kind of, what can you do in a situation like this? But this has become, I think, one of those defining images, not just of the D-Day landings, but of World War II, and indeed of combat, of soldiers in combat. It's one of the most powerful photographs ever made of that moment of actual being in there, in the middle of the heat of the action. And Capa carried on photographing throughout the Second World War. He was a very resourceful character. Remember, he was a Hungarian, so to be able to actually even work with the American forces was constantly a battle for him, and he was always one step ahead of the authorities by getting permissions and faking press cards and so on and so forth. And he was right there at the end of the war. This was one of the last American soldiers to be killed in World War II by a sniper in Germany in 1945. And a very powerful layout in Life magazine of the end of the war. And interestingly enough, the body of the soldier is not censored, but the faces of the two machine gunners there were censored in the magazine, which is quite an intriguing little moment. And censorship, I think, is a very interesting thing. Today we rarely see graphic images, very graphic images of the dead, and as I said before, you never see them of Allied soldiers. But ironically, the photographs from the liberation of the camps in 1945, predominantly from the Western camps, of course, because there were almost no photographs of the liberation of Auschwitz and the camps liberated by the Soviets. So what we now see as being our visual memory of the Holocaust is very overdetermined by the images taken by Allied photographers during the liberation of Dachau, Buchenwald, and particularly of Bergen-Belsen in April 1945. This photograph on the left here was taken by George Roger, who was one of the founding members, along with Capa, of the famous photographic agency Magnum. And Roger had covered the whole of the Second World War, the fighting in North Africa, and obviously the liberation of Europe. But he was completely traumatized by his experiences at Belsen. He recalled photographing a man who literally dropped dead in front of him while he was taking his picture. And he said that he was trying to make interesting compositions, powerful compositions from what he was seeing, and it completely traumatized him. He thought, how can I make an aesthetic picture out of such horror? And after that, he vowed never to photograph another war again, and indeed didn't. But if I want to find extraordinary about the publication of these pictures, these are by Roger and others, is how extraordinarily graphic they were. Remember, this is 1945. Don't forget, the war was not fought to liberate the Jews, but I think once the Allied High Command realized and saw the photographs and the film that was coming out of the camps, they realized this was absolute hard evidence, as it were, of why we've been fighting the war. They'd not really used that as a rationale for fighting the war. Once they saw it, and it was very widely promoted as being the reason why we fought the war. And now, obviously, in our historical memory, we think about the war as being, in many ways, predominantly fought because of Nazi war crimes, not because of all the other sort of global political issues that it was fought for. This is the arrest of Joseph Kramer, who was the Beast of Belsen, he was named. He was the SS Sturmbannführer who was in command of Belsen. At the time it was liberated, and previously to that he'd been a senior officer at Auschwitz. And to me, this is a photograph taken by a fairly unknown photographer, Lieutenant Madingley, who was the commander of the British Army's No. 5 Film and Photography Unit, which again was a specialised unit that was sort of press photography unit really for the British Army. And an extraordinary photograph to me, because for me it is a performative enactment of the process of justice. This is one of the leading Nazis of the day, responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the Second World War at the moment of his arrest by British soldiers. Kramer is, as you can see, he's in his stocking feet. His feet are shackled together with a chain. He's being arrested by two British soldiers who are very legal in their pose. They're quite smartly dressed. They have very stiff bodies. They're very they're like visual representation, if you like, of the forces of law and order. In the background, there on the right, over on the other side there's a rather portly gentleman, little round glasses though, who looks like a sort of the archetype of the citizen turned soldier. He looks like a school teacher or a university professor perhaps, who's become a soldier. And then you've got the US Willys Jeep over there in the corner as well, the kind of symbol of the Allied war effort, the victory of mass production over the German army. And then finally, a very telling little detail, it's hard to see in this picture, but there are actually toilets in the background there, and you've got that little heart-shaped sort of opening in the top of the door there for the smell to be let out. And I find it very kind of Middle European. So the idea the Germans, when they built Belsen, put these little heart-shaped apertures in the tops of the door of the toilets is quite an extraordinary detail to me. So I talked earlier on about the portrait, and the portrait inviting us to have a certain kind of connection with the subject. This is Kramer and Irma Gies, who was, again, one of the commanders, the female commanders of the women at Belsen, in Celle in 1945 in prison awaiting trial. And it's a portrait, it looks like a family snapshot. It looks like a father and his daughter, or perhaps a father and his young wife. So it invites us to have empathy with these people, but then when we know they're mass murderers, it performs what I call a kind of genre slippage. You know, the visual tropes of the image invite a certain reading, but the knowledge of what the image is about invites a very, very different reading. And it's quite an interesting image to look at. And likewise, this picture of Kramer with Mengele was from an album recovered from Auschwitz. It was essentially the holiday snaps of Auschwitz. These were photographs taken by a young German officer of the R&R camp that was just outside Auschwitz, where the German soldiers would go at the weekends to relax and sing songs and generally have a nice fun time with the girls that worked in the camps as well. And so it has all the tropes of the family album, and yet again what's in it is actually very, very troubling and very, very disturbing. Very dramatic photographs, you know, just the idea that you would capture a bomber just about to crash. And of course, aerial warfare and the aerial perspective is a very, very powerful one. This is a picture by Margaret Bourke-White of the destruction of Germany. She spent a lot of time in 1945 flying over the ruins of cities like Dresden and Cologne, making these extraordinary panoramic aerial shots of the destruction. And again, coming back to this idea of photography being a technology and linked very closely with bombing, this is a picture by Harold Edgerton of a nuclear explosion. This is a nuclear test in 1952 taken with an extraordinary camera from about 6 miles away that sort of detected the levels of radiation within the mushroom cloud as it's forming. And there's a whole series of high-speed photographs taken of the formation of the explosion, basically. And they're extraordinarily beautiful objects. They look like kind of octopuses or plankton or some strange life form, and yet it is literally life being extinguished. And this is a photograph taken in Nagasaki in 1962, a very peculiar object, very hard to make out what it is. It's very confusing. Looks almost like an aerial photograph as well. In fact, it's the remains of a bottle that was melted and fused and destroyed by the incredible heat of the nuclear explosion. Again, a photograph almost of nothing. At first glance looks to be rather boring. It's very grey. You can't even see what's going on. But this is the photograph taken by a US Navy photographer of the Tonkin Incident in 1964 that sort of was the spark that was used to set off the Vietnam War. So a photograph that is apparently of nothing, but in fact is incredibly historically important and means a great deal if you can interpret it properly. And of course, the Vietnam War was one of the great sort of themes, if you like, of photography. It was the war, the most photographed war, the war where photographers were pretty much allowed to do what they liked, and journalists for that matter. And a lot of incredibly powerful images, obviously, from that, including this very famous one of what's called the Napalm Girl, taken by Nick Hutt. However, most of the time, the photograph is cropped, And the figure on the far side over there who's reloading his camera is edited out of the picture when we generally see it published. This is the full frame of the negative. And I think it adds a very interesting extra dimension. The kind of media participation, if you like, or presence in this photograph changes the reading of the picture very dramatically, I think, from the one that we're more familiar with. But of course, the war was also photographed by the North Vietnamese. And this is a field hospital in North Vietnam. Apologies, not very good to scan that one. But just a very beautiful picture as well, but a very powerful one, and just giving the other side's view of the conflict. And of course, the anti-war movement used the visual images that were coming out of Vietnam as a major part in its campaigning against the conflict. This is a photograph by Marc Ruboux of anti-war protests in 1967. And again, this was the kind of heyday of the picture magazine. The Vietnam War was kind of the point at which, you know, television was there, but it wasn't quite as ubiquitous as and wasn't as fast as it is today. And the camera gave a chance to make stories that were more reflective, that went beyond the headlines, that spent time with individual people and really kind of told their story. This is an extraordinary story shot by Larry Burroughs, where he decided to spend a day with a helicopter crew flying troops in and out of the front line. And unbeknownst to him, that day turned into tragedy. The mission he was on, the gunner of the helicopter was killed while they were in action, and his body was brought back with the helicopter crew. So it created this very, very dramatic series of pictures that was run as a spread over many pages in Life magazine, and concluded with this very powerful photograph of the guy in the first picture breaking down in tears back at base. And Burroughs talked about how he sort of quietly followed the man to the back of the room and just stood in the doorway and took one photograph of this man completely distraught at the loss of his colleague. But of course, there were photographers that, you know, also tried to critique the conflict there. This is by Philip Jones Griffiths, who did a very famous book called Vietnam Inc., which was a huge polemic against the Vietnam War. And this was a cover of the Sunday Times magazine of a Vietnamese civilian. And again, sort of photography is very, very powerful because it takes specific individual humans in specific moments in time, but can also turn those into universal icons. So this becomes a kind of an icon of the suffering of the Vietnamese people from the American conflict there. So it's a real person in a real place at a real time, but it also becomes this kind of meta-level symbol, if you like, of the conflict. And Griffiths was a very intelligent photographer who realized that's why the book was called Vietnam Inc. This was a kind of, you know, military industrial infrastructure was actually fighting the war, and the war behind the war was more important than the sort of soldiers on the ground. So very few other people would have realized the significance of this, one of the very first military computers being, but Griffiths realized that. I'm sure he was probably the only person that asked for a press pass to go and see the computer. Everyone said, well, that's really boring, why would I even photograph that? But actually, this is a very powerful and telling image of the real nature of contemporary conflict. But he also photographed the troops, you know, abusing the Vietnamese civilians as well back in Saigon, and the whole kind of dark side, the flip side, as it were, of the American conflict. This is a photograph by Ken Jireke that was almost not published from the Iraq War, the first Iraq War in 1991. It was the famous road to Basra that was just where the retreating Iraqi forces were bombed by the Americans, wiping out huge numbers of soldiers as they were leaving the field, as it were. And it was a photograph that was, when he took it, he thought this will be the picture that will kind of really be the statement of the brutality of the war. But almost no newspaper or magazine globally would publish it. It was only published in the Observer newspaper in Britain, inside, or not on the front page. And it was a very controversial picture because, you know, of what happened to it and his the lack of response from Western media, the kind of self-censorship, as it were, of the media. It's a photograph taken by Ron Haviv in the Panama elections in the 1980s, which had a huge influence on US foreign policy. This is one of the people campaigning for the vice presidency against General Noriega being attacked by one of Noriega's thugs. And the picture was used on almost every major magazine front page at the time. And the then President Bush then used this as he publicly quoted it in a live television interview, saying these photographs we've seen of the attack are one of the reasons why we must try and overthrow Noriega, which led to the US invasion of Panama. So a very, very clear link between the photograph and, you know, a government action. And likewise, this photograph also taken by Ron Haviv of the very first moments of ethnic cleansing in the war in former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, in Bijeljina, at the end of March, beginning of April 1992, where Serb paramilitaries from Arkan's forces executed Muslim civilians outside their homes, was very, very influential and has been used many, many times in the war crimes tribunals as corroborative evidence of the chain of command of the actions of the Serbian commanders. I'm going to go a little bit quickly because I'm going a little bit slow. This is by Geo Press of the Rwanda genocide. And again, just trying to look for a symbol that represents the conflict. So not the dead body, but here, the thousands of machetes that were handed in after the genocide, just showing the scale, representing the scale and the violence of the horror. Geo Press is one of the photographers who I argue has shifted from a journalistic mode of witnessing, where essentially you stand and just watch what has happened and report on it, to what I would argue is a position more of bearing witness, where they're actively aligning themselves with human rights organizations, people like Human Rights Watch, and the whole kind of forensic approach to uncovering war crimes and documenting war crimes. And so Gio has worked very extensively on photographing sites of war crimes from the former Yugoslavia, Kosovo, and Bosnia. This is from the Srebrenica Trail of Tears, where the men who were trying to escape from the Serb forces that had captured Srebrenica were ambushed in the hills and mountains above on their way to try and get back to Tuzla. This incredibly, literally photographic negative was taken in Kosovo in 1999. The Serb forces had murdered an elderly man in his home and then burnt the house down around him. And then when his family came back after the NATO liberation, they took the body away and buried it, but it left this incredible imprint on the ground, literally a negative of the man's presence, burnt into the floor of his house. 9/11, obviously, a different perspective on it, a photograph by Thomas Hopke of New Yorkers out on a beautiful morning, just having their breakfast, suddenly confronted with this extraordinary spectacle, literally spectacle, that happened across the Manhattan River from them. Citizen photojournalism, this is a photograph taken after the July 7 bombings on a mobile phone by a passerby, basically. So this sense that the camera has now become ubiquitous, so these kind of global events are recorded all the time. But also just the drama of combat. This is a photograph taken by Goran Tomasevic in Iraq of an ambush where a soldier is desperately trying to fight back against the Iraqi soldiers that are attacking him as he's hit by a grenade. So an incredible dramatic moment of action. I'm just going to fast forward a little bit because I'm a little bit running over time. This is a very haunting set of portraits, coming back to that idea of the portrait, found by Thomas Dvorak, a Magnum photographer. He basically found an album of photographs made by a portrait photographer of the Taliban. So these are sort of passport pictures, if you like, beautifully hand-colored, taken in Afghanistan of Taliban soldiers. And again, just playing with this whole idea of what do we expect from the portrait genre. And of course, photographs have caught those extraordinary, determining, decisive moments in history. This is the Situation Room during the attack on Osama bin Laden, with Clinton and Obama watching the live feed. Imagine how that must be as a president to watch a live feed of US Navy SEALs going in to take out the man you've been searching for such a long time. So I'm just going to conclude by sort of coming to a slightly slower speed of photography, if you like, a more contemplative. And a lot of photographers in the last 20 years or so have sort of turned to what's generally known as the aftermath genre. So rather than photographing the front lines at the moment of conflict, moment of combat, they're thinking about what happens afterwards, looking at the traces that are left, sort of the chronotypes, to use that Bakhtian phrase, of the inscriptions of combat on the landscape. These are photographs by Simon Norfolk, who photographed extensively in Afghanistan, and he talks about literally being able to record the layering of history. Kabul has been fought over by generations of armies. He refers back to John Burke's pictures we saw very early on. And in this building here, you can see it's been hit multiple times over many, many years by all sorts of different munitions, Russian, American, small arms, AK-47s, M16s, you name it, Kabul has seen it over these generations and generations of conflict. So literally written into the fabric of the landscape is the passage of time. This photograph is taken by Norfolk on another project about the war crimes in Bosnia. It is of a lake, which is arguably the biggest mass grave in Bosnia. Thousands of bodies were dumped in the lake, and their remains essentially were dissolved because it's the outflow of an aluminium smelter plant. And the outflow creates this blood red waste product, which when it spills out across this icy lake, obviously has this incredibly powerful sort of visceral sense of it. So again, looking for those traces in the landscape that represent the horrors of the past. Photograph here by Donovan Wiley of the Maze prison. Wiley decided, as a photographer, he was commissioned to photograph the prison, but he couldn't work out how to do that. The Maze prison, for those who don't know, was the prison in Northern Ireland that housed both Republican and Loyalist paramilitary during the Troubles. And it was being destroyed, it was being knocked down, so they decided they wanted to document it before it was demolished. So while he was commissioned to photograph, he couldn't think of an entry point, he couldn't think how he was going to photograph it, until one day he realized that the prison was a system. And if he allowed the system of the prison to dictate to him how to photograph, that would be the way to do it. So he went to every checkpoint and every sort of location that was marked on the sort of the surveillance infrastructure of the prison and made a photograph. So the prison itself told him where to photograph. He positioned his camera at all these sort of surveillance and security intersections and photographed each of those in turn. This is a room set in LA in a computer lab, which is used as part of the US military's virtual Iraq program to help soldiers suffering from PTSD. So they recreate a room set in a warehouse building with all sorts of computer-generated noises and smells and other activities, so that soldiers who are trying to recover from PTSD can be helped to relive the experience as a way of dealing with the trauma. Another room set, this is by Ashley Gilbertson. This is the bedroom of a US soldier who was killed in action, and his family had left the room absolutely untouched from the moment he left to go to serve in combat. And Ashley photographed about 50 of these bedrooms, called Bedrooms of the Fall, in the project he worked on for many years. And then also the kind of the horrific legacy left on serving US soldiers. This is the wedding of a US Marine who was horribly disfigured in an IED explosion and has rebuilt his life, you know, thankfully, obviously, but a very powerful set of portraits by Nina Berman of the veterans. Again, the portrait invites a kind of certain sort of humane gaze. This is a project called Not a Bird Splat, where a group of activists in Pakistan put this huge sort of, you know, football pitch size portrait of a young girl who was killed by a drone strike. And the idea was that as the drone operator sitting in Nevada navigates through his global positioning system and looking down, he will see this and realize there are real people down there, and he should think about what he's going to do when he launches his Predator drone against a potentially civilian target. So it's kind of a direct appeal between the activists on the ground in Pakistan and the actual guy flying the drone in Nevada. I'm just going to go quickly through. This is wreckage from a drone missile collected by activists in Pakistan, then rephotographed by Lisa Bernard in a kind of extraordinarily powerful set of pictures of just the fragments of these hellish weapons. Photographed by Donald Webber this is his symbolic representation of the Maidan revolution in Ukraine. He, along with other photographers, a very dramatic situation, people throwing Molotov cocktails, snipers on the streets, but his way of interpreting that, he realized that the conflict was symbolized by these homemade bombs, these homemade Molotov cocktails. So he literally collected up a bunch of them, 30 or 40 different ones with different beer bottles, and they're incredible sculptural objects. They look like almost they've been taken out of an archaeological museum, and yet these were the weapons that the homemade weapons that the revolutionaries were using on the front lines. Roland Barthes famously said, "The camera is a clock for seeing." And I think that's a very, very important, true concept. This is a picture by Zio Gafic of a watch recovered from one of the victims from the Srebrenica massacre as part of the massive investigation, the DNA and other forms of identification that are used to identify the missing from Srebrenica. And this is in the morgue in Tuzla, and Zio has been photographing every single object, thousands and thousands of these on the mortuary table, to create this sort of extraordinary resource that will help the families locate by looking at the objects that they think their families might have had in their pockets when they were executed. Fred Ramos's picture of he was faced with a similar problem. He was photographing the level of state violence in Colombia and drug violence, and he decided the only way he could represent that was by photographing the clothing of victims of the violence that had been exhumed. And he made these extraordinary, powerful images that are presented almost life-size. So it's kind of the clothing of the victim of state-sponsored violence as a way of kind of representing what had happened to them. Almost coming to the end now. This is a picture by Armin Smilovic of the testimony being given to the ICTY by a female victim who was raped in one of the rape camps in Bosnia in 1993. And to preserve her identity, her image has been pixelated by the War Crimes Tribunal. But it creates a very, very powerful image, I think, because this sort of, the visual aesthetic of that creates this very, very, very intriguing image where you can see her hands giving the testimony, and they are actually non-pixelated because the hand is not, but the hand obviously is a symbol, is a very powerful symbol of appeal, of address, but the face is turned into this strange kind of, you know, computer-generated almost image. And so just a couple of pictures to finish on by myself. As I said earlier on, the Srebrenica massacre did happen on July the 11th, so it's a very, very, sorry if I'm going to maybe choke up a little bit here, because it's a very powerful day for me. But today, in fact, now is the point at which the burial will be taking place of a number of people, because every year thousands of people go to the Memorial Centre at Potocari, and around 11 o'clock, which is in 20 minutes' time, they will be burying some of the remains of those victims who've been identified this year. So I just want to have one moment of memory of the victims of Srebrenica. And at that point, I will finish. Thank you very, very much.